I'm Chretien Gielen. I'm a swine practitioner. I work with 12 colleagues in a practice in Holland. We focus on swine only. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to give a presentation about swine reproduction, about sows, and about group housing, what specific problems that brings. A very short introduction, not of me, but more of my practice. As Mark told, I'm Chretien Gielen, and I'm part of this pig practice that's called the pig practice, quite easily. And me and my 12 colleagues attend pig farms. And we've got our own practice philosophy, of course, like a modern company. And our practice philosophy is raising profitability of pig farms by lowering the prevalence of pathogens, eradicate pathogens, and controlling the risk factors. As you can see, I have to read it myself. It's not like all day this philosophy is in my head. But this is what we do. When we think about what do we do all day, this is what we do. So I was asked to tell you something, to give you a practical approach to reproductive disorders. So it's all about practical. And well, all day we've listened to specialists, consultants, and I'm just a simple veterinarian. So I try to explain it to you the way I see it. And so I make it simple. So this is how I see it. This is how I see sow reproduction. Maybe you don't see what these pictures have in common, so I will tell you. Well, on top there are two pictures of an apple tree. On the left top there are apples, little apples on the ground, and on the right top there are apples still in the apple tree. On the bottom on the right you see a lot of rabbits, and on the left you see a sow. And I think this is what they have in common. What you see on the top pictures is the June fruit drop. That's, well, in our part of the world, in June, the little apples will fall off the tree. And that's why, I don't know why that is, but, well, I do know why it is, because this apple tree, he doesn't want to spend a lot of energy on those little apples. He only wants to put energy in the big apples, who will stay on the tree till the end and will produce the offspring for this apple tree. So there's a system that regulates itself, and if you don't fertilize enough, or if you don't cut the unproductive branches of the tree enough, you'll have a lot of apples on the ground instead of big apples in the tree. The rabbits, what's in common with the rabbits? Rabbits, when there are a lot of rabbits, when the population is really, really intensive and big, female rabbits will absorb their fetuses because they know there will be no place for my offspring when they get born. So that's what they do. And this is the same way I look at reproductive disorders in sows. Return to estrus for me is not more than a signal that a sow doesn't have trust in the future. She is not sure that she will have the opportunity to raise good offspring. So this is what I keep in mind when I'm confronted with sows who return, or too much sows who return to estrus. In words is like this: producing offspring is an investment with a high risk. It's one of the most dangerous things to do for a female animal, is to give birth to the offspring. There's quite, it's difficult, it takes a lot of energy, and there's a high risk for disease and even death. So knowing that we know that when we want to have an optimal production, and that's what we want as pig farmers and pig veterinarians, we have to fulfill the sow's individual needs. We have to be sure that the sow is sure that she will give birth to a healthy offspring and she can raise it. She has to be sure of that. So don't forget about other hormones and stuff, but most of the time I think it's very difficult. I can't remember it, but this is what I keep in mind when I look at a sow who returns to estrus. So this is the first part of the introduction, a practical approach to reproduction disorders. in European sow herds. That's what they ask me, because I live in Europe. I can only speak about European sow herds. That's where I live, that's where I come from, and that's where I work. So these are the sow herds, or the pig density in Europe, and the red arrow points out where I live and where I work. So we're in the middle of the pig industry in Europe. I'm talking about Europe, and I'm here in Asia. You, of course, want to see differences, or maybe a lot of things are the same. Sows are sows, pigs are pigs. But there's one difference, what is going on right now. On television, I heard a few weeks ago that nowadays there are 1.8 billion meat eaters in the world. And within 10 years, there will be 4.8 billion meat eaters. So production have to raise. And what you see in Europe, that consumers, they think that the best way of producing pigs is more like an outdoor system, organic, let's say the old-fashioned way. So we're moving to that side. On the other hand, what I hear from Asia, because I haven't been here a lot, and I even never been on an Asian sow farm, so invitations are welcome. But what I heard and what I'm seeing, that you're moving from backyard farming to more intensively and large-scale farms. So you're moving the other way around. And then thinking of that, well, I'm not sure. I think that within a few years, you will come to Europe and tell, well, in Asia, we're going to do it like this. And that's, well, that works better than what you did in Europe a long time ago. So, but now back to Europe and to my part of Europe, to Holland. I've got the figures. You've solved some figures already about. I don't want to emphasize on the figures after everything John Carr told us about figures and averages and stuff like that. But these are the figures that I've got that I hope are correct. So the average sow farm in Holland is 500 sows. And they produce the average one, so there's more and less, of course, 2.36, well, I should say 2 or 3, but, well, on average is 2.36 liters a year. Every liter is about 40.4 live-born, and of course 1.2 stillborn. The mortality rate pre-weaning is 30.9, or maybe I should say I have to, let's say 86.2 of the piglets survive after the farrowing room, survived the farrowing room. So average wean is 20.9.2 per sow. Most sows are inseminated by artificial insemination, and 60% of those sows are inseminated twice. And the rest of it, just one is enough. It's not a choice, but, well, it's about timing. Total return on estrus is 8%. A regular return to estrus is about 4%, so half of the sows, on average, they come irregular. And the farrow rate adds up at 68% in the end. So that about the figures, forget them right away, but then you've got an image of how we produce in Holland. Well, then, because we're all veterinarians, most of us, I guess, about pig health issues, we are free from classical swine fever, African swine fever, foot-and-mouth disease, and now Yeski's disease. But that doesn't mean we are out of work, because we are very busy with PRRS, Strep suis, APP, Mycoplasma, E. coli, Lawsonia, and that's what I'm going to talk about group housing sows and fertility and reproduction disorders. And maybe you think that group housing has nothing to do with the way you produce, but if not today, at some point in the future it will. And if not so, you can always learn by the difficulties we have with group housing. So this is how it looked like before. I can better look this way. 2012, all the crates were closed. And in January the 1st, all the crates had to be open. And then in Europe, most countries have 4 weeks So after mating, after inseminating 4 weeks, they can keep the crates closed, and then they are set free. But in Holland, we've got a special experiment, and in our country, the law says they has to be free 4 days after insemination. And most of the people today talked about the period before insemination and how important it is, and that's really, really, really important. I cannot emphasize it enough, but I think my talk will go in the period right after mating and what's happening in those early gestation, and in our country it means they are housed in groups. And why? I said before, maybe in the future we'll have group housing, maybe you don't. But even then you can learn from things, because the difference between individual housing and group housing, it's, well, I show you now. The way I look at it, in individual housing, there are a few factors that can influence early pregnancy. So if the sow is going to keep the piglets, or she will return to estrus, throw them away, it's depending on some factors. And some of the factors is the energy status at that time, or the energy status she's in because she had a very long or short lactation period with a high feed intake or low feed intake. All these things have influence on the first weeks of gestation that can make her decide to stop being pregnant. So this is one factor. Another factor is, we talked a lot about ambient temperature and humidity. That's for you, it's a big issue. Also for us, because we've got summers and we've got some heat problems also. And the third, then there's off season, because when sow thinks it's going to be, they know there's going to be winter, and they know it's a bad timing for raising their offspring, they can decide to break off pregnancy. So you need a lot of factors to break off this pregnancy, even when they're good mated, the insemination timing was right, but if the circumstances, the first 4 weeks after insemination are not okay, she will return to estrus. So if you look at group housing, you've got group stress. So all the other factors are also from influence, but we have a sort of threshold that's quite different. So when these factors that we all know have their influence in group housing, we see immediately a problem with a return to estrus. So the things that are important for you during the early pregnancy, of course in our country are very important, but we see it in an earlier stage. So that's why the things I tell you about group housing, the problems we have, I think you can adapt those ideas or philosophy behind it. So I've got 3 cases for you. It had to be practical, and I'm not really a scientific or researcher or something, so I've got real problems and real farms that we attend. And I call them farm A, B, and C, but they are real problems. It's sort of privacy reasons, of course. I don't think you will know these farms, but anyway, I call them A, B, and C. Well, let's start with farm A. Short introduction. 800 sows, groups with floor feeding. I show you a picture of it later so you can see what it means and what the consequences are. This particular farm had a 2-week system in 2 batches, a farrowing rate of 75%. That's not okay. That was the problem in this farm. He was not satisfied with that. So he did the first ultrasound on 21 days. Then 50% of the sows turned out to be not pregnant, and 3 weeks later he did again ultrasound, and 10% more was not pregnant. So that was for him a big problem. And so we have here a hard-headed farmer, I can tell you that, you don't know him, and we had a young and enthusiastic vet. So it's not about me, you can understand. It was a young colleague of mine who first attended this farm, and well, she wasn't that young. It's illegal to have such young veterinarians work for you, but a young veterinarian, a young colleague. And enthusiastic. And this hard-headed farmer had already had his ideas about what causes the problem at his farm. And I show you what he thought. Well, again, these figures, alive were 30.3, so that's not really high productive in our perspective. He had quite a short lactation days, a varying period, you could say illegal. And the rest of it, well, they're not pregnant after the first ultrasound, you've seen it already. And average parity is quite old at that time. Let's move on. So this young, enthusiastic vet, all she knew was, well, book knowledge, and irregular means infectious, and that's what the farmer said. It said it's irregular at the 10% that comes after. I can imagine the 15% return to estrus, but then another 10% turns up as empty, and it must be a disease or some disorder of some kind. So she had she already knew this book, so there were all kind of diseases. In my opinion, to tell you right away, it's really rare that those diseases are the problem in returning in pregnancy. And I will show you during this presentation a lot of examples, some of them. So the farmer said, it must be infectious. Young vet, okay, it's infectious. So, and he said, I found a dead rat, it must be leptospirosis. Because he read in a book, he Googled leptospirosis, that's my problem. Same symptoms as I have, leptospirosis. Or maybe it was Pierce. It's like, well, Pierce is everywhere, so it can be blamed for everything. Same with PCV2. And then the guy who sold him the feed said, well, no, I think you've got urinary tract infections. The feed is okay, it's super, but it's urinary tract infections. And his wife said, well, maybe it's bad karma. So those were the options that my young colleague had to deal with. So, but he already started this farmer with interventions. So what he did, he gave all the sows streptomycin injections after weaning. He intensified the mass vaccination of the sows up to every 10 weeks. So all the sows were vaccinated every 10 weeks. He gave trimsulfa medications in sows. It's rare in Holland. You don't give medications to all the sows at once. It's illegal in our country. And he also, that's true, he bought some magnet from €5,000 or dollar, it's the same, to keep away the bad earth vibes. All those things didn't help, I can tell you. Maybe the magnet did a little bit, but it was not enough. So my colleague started to do some investigation. The first thing she did, she took blood samples, because she thought, well, a lot of use of antibiotics, that's not okay. I'm going to do some blood sampling. And this is what she got. They were all negative, or one of those samples was positive. And what we do when we think leptospirosis is a problem, and we seldom think that, we take samples from abortion sows or returned estrus sows, and the same amount of blood samples from sows that did not abort or return to estrus. And then we compare those groups, because being positive for some serovars of leptospirosis doesn't mean that was the problem of this reproductive disorders. But in this case, there's no discussion about it. They were all sort of negative. Well, sort of, they were negative. Then the other thing, urinary tract infections. That's what the feed guy said. He said, you've got a problem with, I wrote something, I heard something about urinary infections. It's very important, and it's a main cause of returning to estrus for sows. So we took urine samples. What do you think? I took about 15 or 20 urine samples, and I took a picture of some of them. What do you think? Who does think this is normal? So you all think this is abnormal? Or you don't want to answer the question? Okay, I put in the two dark samples in the middle just for the picture. I mean, those were the two only dark samples. The rest of the samples were quite yellow and what I should normal. So, but this is not enough. We're not like in the Middle Ages, look at urine and say, well, that's okay or that's not okay. No, we are sophisticated veterinarians, we do some investigations. So we did bacteriological investigations. We measured the pH. We measured how much protein was in there. And what do you think? Is it normal to find E. coli in urine samples spontaneously? Do you think so? In fact, it is. It's quite normal to find E. coli in urine. When you spontaneously collected urine samples will contain E. coli, especially when you take the first urine out of it. If you take midstream, maybe you've got some negative results, but most of the time there will be E. coli in. pH is normal for urine, for sow urine, this is normal pH. And 2 traces of protein. If you've got bacteriological problems, you will find much more protein. If you've got disorders from the kidneys, you will find proteins. So in fact, this is normal urine. So we could rule out the urinary tract problems. And at last, well, it didn't take like half a year, but after some time, because he didn't have his data really in order, he didn't collect his data quite good, so it took some time to have some good data. And we're trying to figure out what sows are returning to estrus. Can we find out what kind of sow is that? And we found out that 90% of the repeaters was repeated between day 21 and 35. Well, the first one, of course, is the first time he even looked at the sows was at ultrasound, the first time. In the meantime, he didn't do a lot of controlling or inspection in the gestated sows. 30% of the repeaters has a lactation period that was shorter than the 19 days. That's, for us, it's really short. 30% of the repeaters are first parity sows, and as we discussed before, as we heard before, those are really sows that have difficulties with becoming pregnant again. And then a lot of sows repeat more than once. If you look at the records, you can see that that they did before. They came back before the cycles before. So and this is what we do often. We're having groups and having to deal with things that happen when we are not there. Because when we visit farms, we will be there like 2, 3, maybe 4 hours, and that's we do the inspection, and we do it every on the same day. We've got a scheme, so we on farm A, we come there every Tuesday, every 4 weeks, every Tuesday. So it's just one moment that you see. So we use cameras sometimes when we want to figure something out. But this is just a little movie I made in this film, in this farm, because I wanted to know what was going on. And I tried to show you. So what we did is, first I have to start. Does it start already? Okay, now I stop it again. So what we did is, this is what he was doing. This is floor feeding. What is the button? This one? The pointer? Yeah. So floor feeding means that in this particular farm, he would feed the sows twice. And there were containers up here, you can't see it, but you will see them later on in the movie, you will see it. And those containers would, the feed fell on the floor and the sows would eat. It's that simple. And he did it twice because the containers were not big enough for the whole portion, so we had to fill them twice, and then he feeds them. And when we entered the farm right now, it's after the first feeding. And what you see here, I'm not sure if you can see it, those 2 sows are marked, and those are found not pregnant, the first ultrasound, the first pregnancy testing. So, those sows are a little bit on the back. You see this sow, oh, I go point out. What do you think the other sows will, when this sow wants to drink? It's depending on this sow. Will she let him drink or not? So, those are 2 other groups. You see what's happening. This is after the second weaning, not weaning, oh, it stops already. So this is more than an hour later when the second feeding starts. In the time between, well, we're not going to show you a movie for an hour, but the whole period between the 2 feeding systems, sows are looking for feed and fighting and doing things like that. So this is right after the second feeding, and then you can see what happens during feeding. Okay, there's a lot of action going on. Sows are fighting. Some of these sows have barely a chance of getting to the food. You see this one? This is another group. Watch what's going on. Up! Okay, they can't eat anymore. They're finished. Look at this sow. There. There are like 4 or 5 feeding places she's standing over. Now she's coming to the other sow. Look what she does. She doesn't have to do anything. She just comes, and this other sow, she returns. And remember, these sows it's just after insemination. So they're within 4 weeks after insemination. So it's not like it's it's very stable, the pregnancy. If something weird happens, if stress occurs, these sows will return to estrus. Just to show you what this group housing means and what problems you can see. When you have a little list of what can be the problem, there's always stress during early gestation. Well, this is stress during early gestation. And you have to find out why that is. I'm not against group housing. You will have 2 more cases of group housing, and they perform perfectly. But if you do group housing and you're in early pregnancy, so remember that a lot of diseases can cause problems, but in this particular system, I think the system itself is the problem. So what did we do? We're going to feed the whole portion at once, because what happened there is this farmer would feed them when he thought it was time, and sometimes it was 7, sometimes it was 7:30 in the morning, sometimes 8 o'clock and 8:30. And remember, sows don't have watches, but they know what time it is. So if you feed him, you have to feed him every time the same time, every day the same time. Otherwise, they get stressful. Then we ask him to do estrus control before 21 days. So starting at 19 days and using a bore or using bore taint and bore sounds to detect the empty sows as soon as possible. Because when you have sows in a group of all the same stage, it's a sort of contagious. When one sow is returning to estrus, another sow, which has not really stable pregnancy yet, has a chance of joining this sow. So it looks like it's not a disease, but it looks like it's something contagious. So that's what he had to do. When he was thinking maybe this sow is returning to estrus, he had to take out the group and bring her to the mating room. And again, and then something else, we talked a lot about adapting sows and adapting gilts to the new herd. And we started learning those gilts as soon as possible. So the same feeding system was applied in the gilts farm. So that the gilts would be adapted to this kind of feeding. And they knew they're not really stressed because they had to fight for feed. And after some time, you'll find out that those gilts won't fight for. After some time, all these gilts who have learned it, they won't be that aggressive. And at the same time, we advised him to give light 16 hours all seasons. So there's no influence of season. The sows won't notice that the winter is coming. What I'm trying to say with this course is that most times disorders, and because this one course I can't say most of the time, but in my experience, most times disorders are caused by troubles within the system. And I've got some nice little movie that
Who's responsible for this?
If something goes wrong, you find a scapegoat.
Rick.
It's what you do.
What'd you say? Uh-oh.
Kelly.
Okay, so that's quite natural. If something goes wrong, we turn around and we're going, who did it? But most of the time, look at ourselves, look at our staff, look at our system, our farm, and find out what we are doing, what's going wrong. Well, in this movie, the goat was in the production process, so you can't do nothing about that. So Farm B, 1,100 sows, it's a 1-week system. New gestation barn since December 2013, another system, another group housing system, kind of system, and it's called boxes with free space. I show you. It's quite familiar with kind of gestation rooms, you know, besides, the crates are open, that's a big difference. Well, I put down the genetics, it's Topex 20, but the last farm was also Topex 20. Again, the technical data, nearly 30 piglets per year. So he was producing, if you look at it some way, quite well. A lactation period of 29 days, so longer than this, than the farm before. So that shouldn't be the problem. Sows had enough time to reach a high feed intake. That's what you would think. And he had a very low return after first insemination, 9%. But in autumn, the years before this case, you could always see the autumn in his data. He would have a little bit more of return estrus, something about 30%. That was normal for this farm. So when we entered this farm, there's this new farm built half a year before that, and it's becoming September. And then he calls us. It's 2014, it's nearly 2 years ago. A panic phone call, and this is what he was saying to me. He said, something is terribly wrong. Some disease is flying through the herd. It's terrible. He says, when pregnancy testing, all the sows were empty. They were not pregnant. And I see amnions everywhere. I mean, all the sows and amnions everywhere. He was really in panic. I didn't have time to go to him at that time, so I said, well, just stay calm. It's just a season. We've dealt with this problem before. Just give them more light, 16 hours a day, and close the boxes. That's illegal. I shouldn't have said that, but that's what I did. Because I know when there's troubles going around, then those sows returning to estrus will infect other sows, and he will have more problems. So one week later, I was inspecting the farm. I had a farm visit on a regular basis, and this is what I saw. This is in the farrowing room. It's really a picture of this farm. He really were nice litters. The body condition score of the gilts was, they were a plus, means good, but I would say rather fat, big gilts, like the gilt John showed us, the big gilt, something like that, but not that worse. The feed intake wasn't good enough. Insemination room, well, of course, we saw a lot of empty sows. Body condition score in the insemination room was, well, a lot of sows had bruised shoulders or wounds on the shoulders, and that's a sign for losing a lot of body condition in the farrowing room. And all the light tubes were clean. So maybe you give advice about light and having the lights on for 16 hours, but well, I don't know how it is in the farms that you attend, but in a lot of farms I attend, those light tubes are very dirty with, well, I don't know what kind of dirt, most of things are flies. So that's what he did. And in the gestation room, all the sows were locked up. What I always do, I always go through the gestation room and I check the sows at 6 weeks and I check them at 90 days or at the end of gestation. And what I want to see then, and what I tell my farmers is when at 42 days, the sows, the condition has to be restored. So when I look on top of a sow, it should be perfect. And it should be the same. You would see the bones of the hip a little bit. You would have, maybe you can feel the ribs a little bit, but that has to be the same the rest of gestation. Just the belly has to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and nothing else. That's what I like about a good sow. Has to be like that. So that's why I look at 42 days and then at 19 days to see if the sows are developing more body condition, because I don't like that. And I told you I won't going to show you how group housing like this works. Oh. And this is also during feeding time. When things go wrong in group housing, it's mostly around feeding time. We enter now the gestation room just before feeding. So the sows heard us coming in and they know it's roundabout time for feeding, so then this happens. Oh, already started. Yeah. They're moving around. Eating's coming, feed is coming. Quite excited, but no aggression. You see? They go in and out the crates. Yeah, you have to wait some time for the feed sometimes. But I think they are fed now. No. So every sow tries to find a crate. It's really fast. And within a split second, all the sows are in crates. Sometimes the crates are closed automatically. And this farm, he doesn't even close the crates. They just stay. It's no problem. And they are being fed twice a day, every time on clock. Maybe it's easy to say, but I don't think this system causes the problem. So the next time you have to do, who did it? That's what we do. When we look at return to estrus, we want to know, again, which sows are returning to estrus. And we want to know which parity, because we know the first parity in the gills are difficult sows. We want to know when are they returning, the day of return or abortion. We want to know the lactation length. I think that's really important. The number of weaned pigs, that's also important. It's got something to do with each other. And fertility history. And at that time, when a week after he called me, he didn't have all his data in the computer yet. So what I did, I went to the mating room, the insemination room, and I took the cards, we call it sow cards. It's like the paper, maybe you know this kind of papers, the sow number that's on it, the production data, the date of insemination, when it farrowed, how much piglets were weaned, and so this is still in the barn. It's not in the computer yet, and you would find how many, or here you would find how many piglets it produced last time. So, and I took all the papers and I put, the abortion sows or return to estrus sows on the left, and the other sows, the good sows, on the right. And then I just took the bad sows and the good sows and said, what is the difference? What's really the difference? And this is what I saw. The pregnant sows, there were 75, I said 25%. Not all the sows returned to estrus. He lied to me, but in the panic he said all the sows are returning to estrus. All the sows are empty. Well, that's not true. 25%. And what you see then is that the abortion sows, they were younger. On average, they were younger. They had a shorter lactation period, and in the shorter period, they had weaned more pigs. So then you have something to look into. And at the same time, did I show you? But here they are. Like this. So young sows, high production, short lactation period, first insemination at old age. I forgot to tell you. The other thing is what I noticed, that the sows, let's go back again. Here. Is that the sows that aborted or returned to estrus were older when they were inseminated the first time. And what I saw during my round is that I saw that the replacement gilts had a very high body condition score. They were very fat. And I said before, I think it's very important that, this button. It's very important that sows have enough energy intake in the period before they get mated. So they have to be sure about, when they want to be sure about the future, they have to, they rely on the history. So if they had enough to eat, they don't lose a lot of weight in lactation, and they will be fit for the next generation. So what we're trying to do in this farm, we increase the energy intake. So we said we don't wean before 26 days of lactation. We are trying to lowering the room temperature, same with you. So some drip system was used. We got trying to improve the body condition score, lean and mean. Like I said before, I want to have sows that are, I can see the bones and they've got a big belly and they are active. And we put we put groups in gestation, what you saw before. All the sows were in the same group. Lean and fat sows were in the same group. So we made new groups: lean sows, normal sows, and fat sows. And we would fed the fat sows a little bit less, the normal sows normal, and the lean sows, of course, a little bit more. So they have the body condition score between two lines. And at the same time, we have a standard, we already discussed it, and we say at 250 days, a sow has to be 150 kilograms, and then it's ready for mating. And the farmer already locked up the sows. And when we implemented these interventions 1 year later, so it took some time. If you want to restore body condition in a good way, it took more than one round to have all the sows in the same condition. And when you work with groups, you have to reach a kind of uniformity. Otherwise, you can't work with groups. And what you see that 1 year later, after these interventions were done, that, well, this was the dramatic period as I described, and 1 year later there was not much to see of a seasonal influence anymore. Just because everything was right. The sows were quite lean, they could have a high energy intake during lactation, and that was enough to get rid of this seasonal problem. So now I've got the last farm for you. I hope. Oops. Farm C, 1,200 sows, PRC dam bred. Well, I don't think it's important, but just to get a picture. And he made his own breed, something with dam bred and something with PRC in between. I use a Pietran boar. It's a closed herd. Here on-farm semen production, so he has his own boars. He breeds his own boars, and he uses an electronic feeding system. And he has a stable group, so every week batch is one group. He keeps every week batch in the same group. And he introduces the gills into those groups. And the technical, or the figures of this are like this: 1,200 sows, and well, you can forget all about it, but he has a high production. He has 31.6 sows, and he has a farrowing rate of 89%. So maybe you say there's no problem, why should we take notice of the reproduction dates, or is there a problem? But what he does is this: every 6 months, somebody from a breeding company comes and he gets a sort of deep analysis of his data. And what we saw was this, that so a regular 6 months fertility analysis, the farrowing rate was going down from 89 to 86. Well, that's a signal. We already saw that. But what we saw a big maybe that's also normal. We saw that parity 1 and 2 were the bad guys, the bad girls in this case. And we saw that parity, that the older parities, more than the second parity, were producing quite well. So we had to focus, do a deeper analysis on the young sows and young gills. Again, we try to profile what kind of sows are responsible for lowering the farrowing rate. And then again, you've got two groups, again, this one. There are two things that are a little bit strange. The older gills, well, that's not strange. The older gills have a better farrowing rate. And the other thing is that, not strange, but it's a little bit in contradiction of what John said, because gills who were inseminated later had a higher farrowing rate. And again, then we also looked at the first parity, and you see that the first parity who weaned 12 or less had a higher farrowing rate than the first parity who weaned more than 13. Well, that's something you would expect. But the question you have to ask now, why are these older sows and his inseminator is quite old. That's what I forgot to tell you. The average age of first insemination is about 270 days. He does this analysis every time, and he found out that the later he would inseminate sows, the better his production results were. But now it was getting worse. Oops. So we looked into these gilts. There were no clinical signs, there were no mortality, there were no abortions, there were no mummies, so no disease was responsible for this lower farrowing rate. So the question you have to ask then, if these gilts do not well at 280 days, and our normal standards will be 250 days and 150 kilos, are they adapted to farmer, and boar? So we've got two questions. Why do they, they're quite old, but they don't produce as good as they do, and even worse, last few months, are they well adapted? And again, I show you the group. Maybe you'll think, yeah, of course, if you put gilts in a group, then they will return to estrus, but I show you the group, how it functions here. So one batch is 1 week, so what you see here is one group, around 60 sows. It's a movie, okay. So maybe you think it's a photo, but it's a movie. It's all quiet. They've got feeding systems, so on turn they've got a transponder in their ear, and they get a portion every day. And so I don't think this is just one moment, but I can tell you, most of the times, nearly all the time, when you come in this farm, it will be as quiet as this. So the group housing itself is not a problem. And but are the gilts adapted to this? Well, you never know. Well, in this case, they were adapted to the system, but no, this button. But we wondered, why do those gilts have to reach 270 days before we can have an ideal gilt? And so this is what we're going to do there. But I don't have any results yet, but this is what we do on more farms. And what we do is we measure every sow, every gilt before mating. So at 250 days, we weigh this gilt, and we see if he where it is. Is it too light? Is it good? Or is it too heavy? And we've got percentage here: 42%, 85%, and well, nothing is too light. This is not from this farm. This is from another farm. And when we start weighing, we don't have results yet. What you see, all those gilts were at 65 days they were weighed, and they were all here. So they don't develop enough. And I think when you, it's already stated before that the gilts are the future for your farm. So if you're going to introduce gilts and you want to have a good uniformity and a good production for a long period, you have to be sure that those gilts are fit. They fit to your farm. And the least thing you can do is to measure if they're fit. So what we do, and we do it in more farms, is from all the gilt groups, we measure the weight before mating. We measure the weight before the first farrowing. We measure the weight after the first farrowing, and we've got standards for that. And maybe it differs from farm to farm, but we measure it, and then afterwards we do an evaluation, and we're trying to figure out what is for this farm is the best way of introducing, the best moment of introducing a gilt, and when does she produce the best. And working with groups means that you have to be sure about this. If you just introduce gilts and then give it a few weeks to adapt to the system, then you will have big problems. So this is about group housing. And then in short, well, I'm on time. In short, a very short sort of what is in a practical way important for sows. At first you have to start with a good developed gilt. You have to feed it enough, but not too much. you have to protect it. You have to give shelter against humid, against cold, against draft, against heat. That's the other thing. And then the third thing is stress. It has to be free of stress. In the cases I discussed, stress from other sources was a problem, but if you suspect there will be something like stress, hang a camera and make a move for 24, 48 hours and try to find out what is going on in the group, or not in the group or in the gestation room. So rule the stress factors out, and well, then you have a happy farmer and probably a happy sow. Thank you.